Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the next in the series of the DeepCrawl webinars. My name is John Myers. I'm Strategic Consultant and CAB Chair at DeepCrawl. And today we've got a really interesting subject for you guys, as always, with a great title of How to Use Site Search as a Marketing Multiplier, which obviously has me completely intrigued. And I hope that you guys that have signed in or subscribed to the webinar this time around are multiply intrigued by me. So a massive welcome to everybody that's online with us this afternoon. I know you take time out of the day job to be here, so I thank you very much for that. And obviously a massive welcome to Mr. JP Sherman as well.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for taking the time, JP, and I'm really looking forward to the deck. A little bit about JP for all you guys that maybe don't know JP Sherman. He's obviously spoken at many events. He's currently the manager of search and findability at Red Hat, which is a pretty cool title at a very cool company. And it's great to see. I mean, JP, like me, has been in the industry for a while now and has over 10 years experience working within it. So he has effectively earned the veteran tag, which is great to have. And I love the description of your current role, JP. I think a few of us were quite envious of the concept of currently bridging the intention gap between tens of thousands of documents and customers looking for them in Google. I think you underestimate the complexity of doing what you do on a day-to-day basis, sir. And I think that's what's going to ring true. And you're probably incredibly well positioned with great authority to talk about what you're going to talk about today. So it's a really interesting subject, and it's a one which I take a lot of interest in, because for me, if site search is done well, it's incredibly powerful, and you'd be amazed how many companies out there don't do it well. And I'm hoping that JP today is having a look at these slides is going to give you guys some interesting thoughts and tips to take back to the office and really make you think about how you position yourself within site search. Marrying up me as an SEO of many years, and JP the likes, marrying site search up with Google can drive amazing ROI and amazing results because of how you think about how you get that content into not only the search engines, but then how you navigate those people through the site once they arrive as users and ultimately customers. So I'm absolutely massively say underestimate this at your peril in some respects, and I think we've got a lot of good stuff to come. So just to give you guys an idea of anybody that's new on the line, I mean, many of you have been with us before. It's absolutely the usual format. We're going to do 30 minutes to 35 minutes of presentation, and then we will get into the Q&A element of obviously the webinar, which we love, where I get to ask and grill JP about all of those wonderful questions that you guys will submit as we go through this. Please don't wait till the end. Add the questions as we go. JP says something that really catches your ear or your eye on the slides. Please do submit that question, and we're taking the questions as normal in the chat box on the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar screen. So where you can see that chat box, please type the question into there. I'll then pick those up. I'll organize those questions, and I like to try and get through as many as I can. On a few occasions, we've obviously had too many, and I've had to do a little write-up with a follow-up blog post on the remaining questions. But please put them in there as JP goes through the process. As always, we are recording the session. So as of tomorrow around midday, we will publish a full audio version of this session, backed up with a blog post on the DeepCrawl blog, to give you guys the lowdown that you needed to give the stuff to go back to the office. So for anybody that didn't attend, to be able to read through it and obviously listen on the webinar too. And please, there is a short survey at the end of this webinar, which allows you guys to give us the feedback and let us know what you think, good or bad. If you really enjoyed it, please let us know. If there's things that we can do better, please do let us know, and suggest some topics as well. There's some burning topics that are out there in the marketplace. Let us know about it, and we'll see if we can get some great speakers lined up like we have in the past to cover off these topics. So without further ado, I want to hand over to Mr. JP Sherman, who is the enterprise search and findability expert at Red Hat, to take us through his presentation on how to use site search as a marketing multiplier for the next 30 to 35 minutes. And thank you again for being here, JP, and over to you, sir. The floor is yours.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, I definitely appreciate the opportunity to be able to share my enthusiasm and my experiences in this really kind of niche part of search. So, as you said, my name is JP Sherman. Next slide, please. And in short, what I do is I connect people to the information that they're looking for. And this means that I don't just do SEO. This means that I am looking to connect people to information through whichever channel they prefer to find us in, be it SEO, voice, chat, or even Google, and then site searches, which is where I really do most of my work. Next slide, please. So a little bit about me first. I accidentally got into search technology when I was working for the US Army Special Operations in PSYOP, where we did information dissemination campaigns online with the full consent and knowledge of everyone around us. I studied biology and anthropology and focused in behavioral science. I've done agency work, I've done in-house work, and what really got me into this was when I was recruited to essentially build the relevancy engine for a search engine for video game startup. And now I've used that as part of my toolbox at Red Hat. Next slide, please. So today, we're really going to be talking about a couple of things. Why is on-site search important? How do we measure it? And then what actionable things can we take away from it? Next slide. And one of the things that I find, especially now that voice, mobile, desktop, search is fracturing and it is splintering, but the behavior is the same. The behavior of search on mobile is very, very similar to the behavior of search on desktop. And the problem is that we don't have a good way to customize site search and the results people get, in the sense that people are looking at on different platforms. So we need to understand that the results that they're given on whatever platform that they're using needs to be almost a unique experience to that particular platform, whether or not the results change or not. Next slide, please. So as I started to get into this this particular facet of search, we know that less than 18% of organizations dedicate resource to on-site search. And that's some research from, I believe it was eMarketer about 4 or 5 years ago. The number may have changed, but from my understanding, it hasn't really changed significantly. So we know that a lot of people know about site search, but they don't really dedicate resources to it. Next slide. And the biggest problem is that 2 years ago, I did some original research with about 20 companies combining e-commerce, knowledge content, and other types of sites that use search on their site to figure out what's the abandonment rate. And we found that one of the behaviors that humans have is that they use your site search because they think you have what they want. If they can't find what they want, they no longer think you have what they want. And they know that, and they don't want to be bothered by bad results. And so more than half of users abandon a site if they don't immediately get the results that they're looking for or that they intend. Next slide, please. The other thing that complicates and assists the user abandonment is that users know that Google is less than a second away. If they can't find what they're looking for on your site, they drop right back into the browser and they search Google, and generally they're going to find it. And if you're not there as well, this is a potential opportunity lost. Next slide, please. And this directly translates into lost revenue. Things that cannot be found cannot convert. And we know that if they can't find it, they're gone. I'll pause. Just to give you a little bit of a heads up, I'm actually using a Linux machine because obviously I'm at Red Hat, and the deep crawl or the GoToMeeting platform that we're using doesn't support the version of Linux that I have. So I apologize for the technical difficulties. So next slide, please. Now, When a user searches your site and they find what they're looking for, do balloons drop from the ceiling? Are users happy? Like, do they get that warm, fuzzy feeling? Next slide. No, that's the expectation. Users expect a good experience. Users expect to find what they're looking for because Google has habituated them into actually finding what they're looking for. So you get very few positive gains from actually delivering good results. Next slide. The problem is that when they don't find what they're looking for, they remember. Good results are what's expected, and bad results are remembered. So this is a critical issue in terms of influencing behavior, influencing click-through, and ultimately capturing revenue from your users. Next slide, please. So this is why, next slide, site search is critical. The best things about site search, when it works well, it amplifies, it multiplies, it assists, and it informs everything that you do, all the conversions, the feelings of trust and authority. This is why site search is critical. And one of the issues is that generally people have poor experiences on site search. So when you can actually deliver what they're looking for, they can seamlessly find the information that they're looking. They can seamlessly find the information quickly. Next slide, please. So how do we measure site search? What are the things that I look at when I look at the quantitative data about how to measure site search? Next slide. So I kind of see it as this kind of Voltron of attributes. We have passive behaviors, we have active behaviors, we have the concept of findability, we have search features, and then we have result set quality. So each one of these things influence how search presents itself, how users interact with search, and then ultimately the quantitative measurements that you can take from the results that you give the user. Next slide. So findability boils down to what people do, how people behave, how people react to the content presented. And findability is a really fantastic field of study that includes things like UI, UX, design, writing, information architecture, and even SEO. So it's a way to measure, to look at the entire field of these tasks and orient it towards being able to connect users to information. Next slide, please. But first, I'm going to talk about a little bit of science about the active search. There are two basic types of search. There's passive search and there's active search. Passive search is, like I said, it's passive. It's when you're driving in a car and you're looking for, you're scanning the road and you're looking for potentially erratic drivers. And when you notice this, you can react. Active search is when there is an intention behind the search. Active search is looking for your keys when you lose them. Active search is entering a keyword and then searching the results. So understanding that there are these two behaviors that happen and they switch almost instantaneously is really important to know, because there are some very interesting things that happen during active search. Next slide. So after a keyword is delivered to the search engine, the person scans the results with purpose and intent. Sometimes that intent is not a part of the query. Sometimes that intent is just in the head of the person looking. So this means that when a user sees your search snippets, they come with that, with acceptance and rejection criteria. They can immediately look at a snippet and say, this works, this might work, this definitely does not work. So part of what good search design needs is an understanding of intent and being able to display that in a way that communicates that value to the user. So this is something that some people in the industry call a perception of value. And I'll go into this a little bit later, but the thing is that when you look at a search engine snippet for less than a second, the perception of value needs to be immediate and valuable to the user for them to take an action. Next slide, please. So in one of my former jobs, I worked for a retailer that sold bicycles online. And one of the things that I noticed was the trend of most of my competitors having their title tags be road bikes, pipe, brand. Road bikes, pipe, brand. And I thought this was stupid because a bike isn't a necessary purchase. It's there's a lot of emotion tied to it. So I did an experiment. I asked forgiveness rather than permission. And next slide, please. I built our title tags to optimize for action and emotion. So I put in on several of our categories like lightweight and fast bikes for the open road, or kids bikes, durable, reliable bikes for kids. And when I started optimizing for action and emotion and connection, we found that for road bikes, where we had never ranked on the first page before, we were suddenly above Trek bikes. We were beating REI. We were beating Amazon. We were beating Walmart for kids bikes. And part of that experiment was at any position, when people are scanning, if we can immediately convey the value and emotion to a user, that was absolutely critical. So from the SEO side, we were able to increase our rank. From the site search side, we were able to increase our conversions because people were immediately connecting with the value of what was said as a part of the metadata. Next slide, please. So some of the active behaviors are boiled down to things like keywords, click-through rate, conversions, no results, 0 clicks, and instances. Instances is a little funny, so I'll go into that a little bit later. But we look at the keywords delivered. We look at the average click-through rate. And the click-through rate in this case, we can't assume that with a good click-through rate, they found what they were looking for. That's where we tie in conversions. We look for searches that have no results. This means people are looking for things that we just don't have, but for some reason they think we have it. So is that something we need to look into, or is there a way that we can redirect them into something similar? We look for pages or keywords that have 0 clicks, and we wonder, why is this happening? We look at the result sets, and these kind of things, specifically with 0 clicks, one of the really cool things that we can do is if we find errors or just weird things happening with our content, these pieces of content can be queued into a content revision pipeline and then measured in the future to see, are we now getting clicks? The bit about instances is that there's a habit of people measuring essentially only the thing that is clicked on. But generally, there are 9 other things on the page that people could click on. So one of the things that we do is we look at content that shows up on the search engine results page as an instance for content, almost like an impression. So it's like an advertising impression. So we look at content that has high instances or high impressions, but low clicks. This is another signal of either quality or poor content. And so a lot of what we can do with that information when we start looking at the entirety of the SERP and filtering out some of the poor impressions or click-through rates of content that actually shows up, that can again be filtered into a content revision queue. Next slide, please. So as search professionals, we generally have a good idea of what a keyword is. The way that I look at it is that keywords really aren't just a bag of words. To me, that they are vehicles through which a user's intent is expressed. Google has done a lot to really figure this out. But when it comes to site search, most site search programs or platforms, they look at the keywords or query delivered, and they just look at the words. They don't really look at the relationships between the words, the modifiers that some words give. And while there's a lot of work being delivered in natural language processing and a level of intelligence, this is one of the reasons why site search generally sucks. Next slide, please. So part of how I look at it is types of keywords. I look at high volume, low intent. High volume, low intent would be a word like shoes. A lot of people search for it, but there are so many different types of shoes, this gives us no actual information. Next slide, please. Low frequency, high intent. These are queries that deliver exactly what the user is looking for. Things like download latest iTunes or pictures of cats in baskets. High intent, low frequency. These are things that, especially when given like a 0 results, this may be something that can be turned into a content creation queue. Next slide, please. So now qualitative behaviors. These are very passive behaviors that people exhibit on search. We look at consumption, we look at dwell time, and we look at the time from query to consumption. So consumption is a little tricky, and that's a whole nother subject. But when you don't have conversions associated with the landing page of the search results, you want to know if they've consumed that content, and that can be incredibly tricky. So the way that I generally look at it is I look at it from a how much time did they spend on that particular page when they've landed on it. And if there's enough consistent, if the content is fairly consistent, you can start making some good assumptions about whether they read the page. The best idea is to add micro conversion events, such as a, did you like this? Was this helpful? Something like that. While they generally get very low responses, but having something on knowledge pages that can signal a micro consumption can really, really help out. I look at how much time they look on the search engine page, and then I look at the time from query to conversion. And if I know that people generally convert from the query to buying something or putting something into the basket in 3 minutes, I'm doing a good job if I can reduce that time to 2 minutes. Next slide, please. So search features are things that can assist the natural results. Having a section that says more like this, having facets, having knowledge graphs, and have some sort of query suggestion or completion. So with that, you can actually build aspects onto the SERP that assist a user's intent. Next slide, please. So on the Red Hat customer portal, these are some of the things that I've built. The first one is a set of facets. These are inline right below the query, and so this assists us with determining intent. When users look for update software and then they click on Red Hat Satellite, we can look at how many people intend to update a particular piece of software with a very generic query. We have a thing called key match, which is essentially like a paid search ad. It's an artificial boost that is visually different when we know exactly what somebody is looking for. We've built a knowledge graph using some of the data that we have. So when somebody gives us a high volume, low intent keyword, this knowledge graph right here allows us to figure out when somebody types in a high volume, low intent word, do they go towards overviews, the product page, the downloads, trying it out, or documentation. And this works in almost every single type of high volume, low intent word. And then of course we have the natural results. Next slide, please. So now when I start looking at measurement, like does this work? We don't have a key match for every query. We don't have a knowledge graph for every query. So I use what's a weighted findability score. So when I look at the essentially click-through rates of each different feature as they happen, I can aggregate that information and come up with a weighted findability score. And I call this findability score the likelihood that a person found something that they wanted to click on. I don't call it a measurement of search success, but this is more of a description of value. Search success is more about consumption and conversion. Next slide, please. So what's a good click-through rate for site search? And because Google is so good at what it does, I've generally found that the number of complaints that I get significantly drop when I have a click-through rate of over 75%. And I feel like this data is fairly significant because the volume of queries that we get week over week is incredibly high. And when I went back to the my e-commerce metrics, I found around the same time, around the same measurements. So if you're running below a 75%, you may not be doing a bad job, but users kind of feel that search sucks and you need to die in a fire. But then there's almost like this magical switch happens after 75%. People think that you're magic. So you're not doing a bad job if you're less than 75%. This is more about measuring user perception of your search results. Next slide. So results set quality. How good are the things that rank for your queries? On the content level, I look at average rank. I look at the content as an impression. I look at individual keyword click-through rates. I look at consumptions and keywords from those particular queries. And if I find that an individual piece of content has ranks for 10 keywords and 5 of those have a good click-through rate, I would say that this is a successful or match to that intent. But if they have a really, really low keyword click-through rate from that particular keyword, this is where the gap is. So this is where I start talking to our content writers and we figure out what's happening, how can we improve this? And sometimes you'll just find content that is so old or so poorly tagged with metadata that, again, these are things for your content revision pipeline. Next slide, please. So findability, again, is the ability of a person to find what they're looking for quickly and with minimal effort. Relevancy is different than findability, although it is a part of findability. And to me, it's the ability of an information retrieval system to deliver the content that matches the user intent. And I tend to optimize for relevance because that is going to deliver a better experience for the user when they're searching your site. Next slide, please. So findability is made up of active behaviors that we've talked about, passive behaviors that we talked about, the features of search, and your results set quality. When you start looking at the findability score from those active behaviors, from those passive behaviors, and specifically from how users react quantitatively from the search features, then you could start understanding how easy is it for users to find your content. Next slide, please. So how do we improve this? And obviously the SERP is the very first thing the users see after a search, and first impressions are really critical. This is where search becomes UX UI. The design of your SERP is absolutely critical. It needs to convey a level of information that is immediately recognized, but not so deep that they have to really spend time to understand it. That goes down to your snippet design. Do you have different content types that have different behaviors or intentions? On the knowledge side, it's like, are you troubleshooting or are you installing? On e-commerce, do your snippets need good pictures or is it more textual? And overall, it's a really deep respect for the user's time. You want them to enter, find what they're looking for, and then accomplish their goal. Next slide, please. So one improvement to do is auto-suggest. And this is very, very popular across search engines. These are related keywords that are similar to the initial query, but are different from a nuanced level. And when users see this, one, they kind of get the impression that you know what they're talking about. And two, they can actually drill down to a much more specific, much more nuanced, much more intention-based query then they may know what to do that they may have had themselves. Next slide. So with autosuggest, so searches that don't have autosuggest. Oh, I'll pause for a second. There we go. I appreciate your patience. Thank you so much. All right. Next slide. There we go. So in general, when you combine e-commerce and knowledge-based content, without autosuggest, you tend towards a click-through rate of around 42% and a conversion rate of 33.9%. Searches with autosuggest, because it gets you closer to the intention of the user, you have a significantly higher click-through rate and you have a significantly higher conversion rate. So that is one improvement that you can do that can improve your site search results, not your results, but the behaviors that people actually perform. Next slide, please. Autocomplete, which is a little bit different than autosuggest. So autocomplete is something that some search engines do to kind of predict what you're going to be typing. It's usually combined with autosuggest. And next slide, please. When you're looking at from a dwell time or a time from query to conversion perspective, it takes people longer to click on a thing, on a result, without autocomplete than with autocomplete. So this is a function of respecting your user's time, making sure that they find their information quickly. So autocomplete is generally out of the box a good thing to do. Next slide, please. So this graph can be a little confusing at first, but this is about alternative paths to failed searches. So the blue line represents searches that failed, as in nothing was displayed, people didn't click. So if you notice that people are not clicking on things, giving people an alternative, such as did you mean or people also searched for, these types of pathways to refining that search after a failure, more people search when you give them a way to continue that experience. And the difference between the delta between the red and the blue lines, that is revenue, that is profit, and that is a kind of a second chance to get it right. Next slide, please. So one thing that I got to do that I thought was really, really cool is understanding context. So for example, for the keyword bike tires in Santa Monica and for the keyword bike tires in Colorado Springs, we noticed that people in Santa Monica were generally looking for road bike tires. But we also noticed that in Colorado Springs, people were generally looking for mountain bike tires. But the keyword was exactly the same. So we built a location detection based on IP address. And when people were looking in areas that we knew preferred road bike tires, we biased our results to road bike tires. When people were in Colorado Springs, we biased our results towards mountain bike tires. Again, without the user having to expressly show their intent, we were able to understand their context and deliver them closer to the results that they were looking for. And as a result, conversions were significantly higher. Next slide, please. Another improvement is a knowledge graph, similar to the one that we see on Google. So for us, what we've done is when we see these types of queries that can have multiple intentions, we built our own knowledge graph. And the way that we do this is having, we built it in JSON and we key it towards, we have keywords that are tagged, or it shows up for particular keywords. And we have things like broad match, exact match, negative match, phrase match. So we try to get this knowledge graph in front of people, especially in our business when there are vulnerabilities that come out. Our traffic spikes, our search instances spike, and we know that people are looking for this information. So combining the key match and knowledge graph, we're finding that a lot of people almost ignore the natural search results and they go directly to the knowledge graph. If you can actually provide a way for them to understand what they're looking for, knowledge graphs are great. You don't need fancy computing or any kind of machine learning to do this. These can be curated. Next slide, please. So when you're looking at on-site search from the content side, this is stuff we already know. Content, metadata, structured markup, links, relevant titles, UI, UX. I'm not going to go over the best practices of SEO, but the things that you do in SEO for Google also help you for site search. The thing that I do want to say though, and really kind of point this out, is while none of the major search engines even consider keyword metadata, site search, I'm sorry, next slide, please. For site search, keyword metadata is critical. This is where, because site search it's not Google, adding keyword metadata tags and information really, really helps. So while most of the industry has kind of ignored keyword metadata because it doesn't work for Google, for site search, it's critical. Next slide, please. So now we're going to take a look at measuring the content efficacy. When it comes to on the content level, what is the keyword universe? What keyword universe does that piece of content rank for? We look at the conversions, consumptions, the impressions, average ranks, click, and click-through rate. And I'm going to go into this in just a little more detail on the next slide. So if I have a page about peach pie recipes, what's on the left-hand side are the keywords that deliver traffic to that page. Overall, on the right-hand side are my total stats for that particular piece of content. So next slide, please. So now I'm going to break it down. The individual keywords that I get, peach pies, recipes, gallery, and ideas, there starts to emerge a pattern of behavior where people who search for peach pie recipes and land on the peach pie recipe page, they're happy. For people who search for peach pie gallery, and then they find the peach pie recipe page in the SERP, they're less happy. So take a look at this content. Why does it rank for peach pie gallery? Is this a page that we need to build? Because there is a good amount of impressions and there is a good amount of keywords, queries generated. Next page, please. So we take a look at the keywords. We can deboost the keyword for low performance. Apologize. We can keep the page as it is. We can figure out why it ranks, and then we can work to see it rank in site search. So these are all the options that you can use to modify the content as a part of a revision queue. So testing. I test a lot. And this comic is basically me all the time at work. Next slide, please. I fail a lot. At any given time, I'm running at least 6 to 8 A/B tests in search to figure out how to improve user behavior. Next slide, please. So things like disambiguation. Having a way to recognize disambiguation. If my keyword is Halo, I could be looking for a video game, a G.I. Joe character, a song by Beyonce, a type of galaxy, a type of airborne trooper. Being able to understand how keywords overlap with different things is a big part of disambiguation. And you'll generally find these situations when you have good keywords with very low click-through rates. Next page, please. Design for mobile. I have found through some of the research that I've done is that what works on desktop will not work on mobile. So being able to segment your site search audience by mobile is absolutely critical. Next slide, please. 10 blue links may not even work. Google does what it does because it's good at what it does and it understands users. But in the automotive industry, site search is primarily visual. In some sorts of e-commerce, specifically things like in technology or some sort of component search, having side-by-side comparison searches are absolutely critical. So the idea that you have to stick with 10 blue links on your SERP may not work for you. Next page, please. Another way is blend them, just show everything. Design your SERP page so that it captures all of the intent. The downside is that you kind of create a lot of information for the user to consume, and they may end up being spoiled for choice. But it's definitely a thing to test if you know that your search results isn't close to giving your users what they're looking for. Next slide, please. So one of the things I advise is that, it may seem that like the 10 blue links is what should happen. Google does it and Google's doing it great. But one of the things that we know now is that Google is changing its SERP constantly. And so following Google may not be the best strategy for you in terms of SERP design. Next page, please. You know your customers. Challenge the mold. Create search experiences that align to user behaviors. You don't have to do what Google does. You can do what you want to do. And once you start collecting more data, you can serve your customers better and deliver a better site search experience for them. And that's really kind of the core aspect of what I'm trying to communicate as a person who does this. Next slide, please. So overall, change the snippet, change the SERP design, add contextual information, measure, and mobile is unique. Next slide, please. If you don't have a search dev team, there are some good options out there. I use Solr, but there are some other fantastic organizations out there that do provide search solutions, custom search solutions, data and intelligence from site search. Next slide, please. And again, I just really want to express my deep appreciation for being invited. I hope that you've all found something valuable. Please feel free to find me on Twitter and bug me. I'm generally fairly active and I almost respond to all questions. Once again, thank you so much. Thank you for your time. That's it.
Fantastic. Thank you, JP. Great deck. Loads of really good content, really actionable tips, which is fantastic. So really appreciate you taking the time to take us through that and ultimately put it together. So I'm kind of going to kick the question off, the first question kind of thing, and just you talked earlier on about auto suggest, and the different click-through rates. I mean, the CTR on that seems to be about 15% better for auto suggest in place or compared to not using auto suggest. So the obvious question has been asked is, why is it so much better? And is it better for certain verticals as well? Just to add a double layer to it.
So I don't want to call users lazy, but users are kind of lazy.
Feel free to. I mean, honestly.
And part of it is that, like, it's more about optimizing the user's time so they can complete their query faster, but on a deeper level. It's about allowing the users to visualize different variations of what they're looking for so they can match the query to their intent better. If I look for black leather shoes on Google, like there are times like black leather Doc Martens or black leather Adidas, and I'm like, ooh, I like Doc Martens. I'm gonna filter. I'm gonna self-facet my search for Doc Martens. And this is primarily why auto-suggest and autocomplete get you better click-through results, because it's a natural, intuitive, automated way to self-filter your query, so that essentially your result set is smaller than what it would be.
Right. Okay. That's good to know. And just following on from that, just a quick question here from Matthew Katz. He's saying, which kind of follows on from the CTR piece. How are you pulling the data for CTR on results? Is there any way of doing this via Google Analytics?
The best way that I've found to do it on Google Analytics, and I'm just full disclaimer, I don't use Google Analytics. Red Hat, we use Adobe Analytics, so I'm much more familiar with Adobe than with Google. But I believe that there are some good ways to actually do this through Google Tag Manager. Although, full disclosure, I'm not an expert yet. It's something that I'm starting to dig into. Because I put out so many stats, I'm always questioning whether my stats are, good, or if they're just kind of BS because of my sample sizes. And so one of the things I'm trying to do right now is to build a community Google Tag Manager plugin to anonymize and collect and aggregate things like abandonment, overall click-through rates by vertical. And so this is a research project that I'm working on right now. But the impetus for that is that there is so little data, there's so little research that's been done on site search that I can kind of go crazy with researching, but I really want to try to focus, because I tell people that it's around 55%. It could be 60, it could be 54. I just don't know yet.
No, it's fair, and it's a good point. It's better to hedge your bets in some respects on that one as well. We just had our first thank you. Nick Wilston says thank you very much for some great content. So thinking about tools as well, there's a couple of questions here from Holar and Rachel Costello, who are both kind of asking the same question in some respects. So what tools do you use to help you with, findability for measurement? And then also, what are your sort of trusted tools for measuring, site search data?
So I'm in kind of a fairly unique position where I work for an enterprise level company, and so I actually have analytics developers that I work with. And
we all wish that we had that, wouldn't we?
Right. And so so I use Adobe Analytics. I use Adobe's DTM system, and I work with our analytics developers to create custom metrics. I am having conversations with some of the search plugins and search applications, companies like Lucidworks, to I'm dying for somebody who has more technical or development experience than I do, to create plugins for Google Analytics to collect some of these custom KPIs that I've been able to develop on our own, to share them out to the overall community. Essentially, I want to be super Red Hat about this and open source it.
Right. Wow. Hopefully there's somebody listening in that wants to get involved. I mean, you said to hound you on Twitter, you might get a few off the back of that comment.
That would make me incredibly happy. and literally part of it, because so few people talk about this, part of what I want to do is increase the level of awareness of what we have and more importantly, what we don't have.
Yes, no, I totally agree with that. Marianne Sweeney is just saying thank you for a stellar presentation, but then she follows on with a question, just asking, are there reports from site search appliances that would guide tuning for relevance?
Yes, those can cost a pretty penny at times. So one of the things that we have a machine learning layer that sits between our Solr instance. Solr is it's an open source Apache project search engine that we use. So we have a machine learning layer that sits between it. And one of the things that we are working with that machine learning, and I think they call it AI, but I don't really think it's AI. Is essentially working on a way for intention grouping, so that we can automatically identify from a particular query what are similar queries that have similar intentions. Those I haven't really been able to find any tools that have that are generally available to the public that can be usable. But the one thing I would recommend is there's a couple of conferences done by some of these companies. One of them is LucidWorks. It was called Solar Revolution. I think this year it was called Activate. So
right.
getting into, so for search people to get into the actual technical search communities, the tech search communities, they know how to build search engines. We know how to make sure that, like, how it affects the end user. So that's what I would recommend. But our communities don't, there's not a lot of overlap yet. So yeah.
Interesting. No, I mean, it's an interesting point to make. It's obviously clear there's some sort of development of the industry in some respects, and it kind of organically evolving in some ways, and people getting together to actually make that happen in some respects. So interesting. And actually, an interesting question from Simon Cox as well. Says obviously users will be used to the way that Google answers their questions, in the same context of a search engine. How do you try to achieve something like that with an internal search?
Oh, that's such a great question.
It is, isn't it? I thought that was usually with that as well. It's kind of trying to buy some time to come up with an amazing answer. So,
I think from the very base of information, that's something that was going to require a level of structured markup and schema, and a level of entity recognition that is under the surface and is working to recognize things as entities. I've run an experiment where actually one of the things that I tried to do was, if there was a particular software component that we recognized was also in Wikipedia, that we would use Wikipedia's API to pipe an abbreviated answer as an answer box. So that's one way to do it. Unfortunately, it looks like crap. We couldn't control Wikipedia's. We couldn't control the language in Wikipedia, and we found that for us it ended up being a distraction to the user as opposed to an enhancement. And part of the reason, one of my hypotheses was that people don't think of site search engines as an answer engine. People are beginning to look at Google as an answer engine, as in, like, why do things hurt? They don't look at site search engines as reaching that standard where they even think of it as an answer engine. So for us, it was a distraction, but there are so many different ways that it could have been better, such as having better taxonomies, having better taxonomic descriptions, curating our own content on components. There are so many ways that we probably could have made this better that just lead to more time and more work. That ultimately, I think it's a valuable idea.
Yes.
But the way I executed it, because I tried it, fail fast, fail cheap. I don't think that the way that I did it was useful to our customers.
Interesting. No, I mean, great. I love the fail fast, fail cheap. That's a really good analogy of kind of how to put it. Just a few more thank yous for you as well, Sue. And here we've got Nicole DeBrace, Ricardo Diaz, and Adrian Cook saying, thanks for a great presentation, and fantastic content, and some has been really insightful and very helpful to next steps for them in the office, which is fantastic to hear. So thank you guys for those messages. Only got time really for one more question. Orit Busnik has asked for me quite an interesting one. It kind of ties into the first question a little bit around verticals. What do you think are the most important factors for e-commerce businesses, particularly fashion, looking to optimize mainly visual search?
Another great question. So what I'm about to say is my opinion and not based upon any kind of deep experience with that particular vertical. So I would imagine that in terms of knowing your customers, I think that the critical thing is understanding what counts as valuable to your customers. For computer components, part of it is speed, hard drive size, things like that. For fashion, it could be color, it could be season, it could be something else. So if you understand what is really valuable to your customers, then exposing that as part of the SERP design can actually be really, really helpful. Even things as having, I would imagine that fashion like car sales would also be very image biased. Yes. So if there are some sort of like the thing that I would suggest that would probably fail, but I would still test it anyway, is having a high quality image of the fashion as a part of the SERP and snippet design, and test whether or not having an animated rotating GIF is helpful or having a static image would be helpful. Yes. So that's what I would look for. That's where I would start.
No, it's a really good point, a great idea as well, and hopefully that's helpful for Orit as well. I mean, we're out of time, so I mean, a massive thank you to everybody that's tuned in and listened to obviously the webinar today. I think it's a really, really interesting subject, and I think I'd love to do a follow-up session on this next year again, kind of thing. So I think there's so much we could talk about on this. It really is an evolving process, as you say. I think there's things that need to change and come a long way, and I still find it amazing that stat that you threw in the middle, just that 18% of companies dedicate resource to site search. I mean, this should be, in my opinion, and maybe I'm jaded by the fact of the types of work that I do, a fundamental first thing that you should be thinking about in the foundation of success online. And the fact that you're doing that day to day, JP, with an amazing company like Red Hat is great to see, and it's great to see the fruits of your labor coming through and what you guys achieve as a business. As I mentioned, guys, this is being fully recorded. And we've obviously talking for the last hour in the presentation. All the slides will go live on the Deepcrawl blog tomorrow around midday with the full audio of the session. And obviously we'll email that out to anybody else who signed up for the webinar as well. Please do take the time to fill in the survey. We really do appreciate your feedback. I mean, I think this has been fantastic content. The questions are great, and obviously you guys are already chipping in via the questions box to say thank you very much to JP for the fantastic content. To say one of the great lines on here, JP, which I can see, is it was really insightful, and it gave me many ideas on how I can speak to people internally about this subject and go on to the next steps, which is kind of exactly what we want to try and achieve with these webinars. So a massive thank you to our presenter today, Mr. JP Sherman from Red Hat. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Please do stalk him on Twitter. He has thrown it out there in the open. He likes to tweet and he likes to interact. So if there's any other questions off the back of this, please do shout out JP on Twitter, and I'm sure he'll get to you. Any questions that we didn't get a chance to ask, we'll get over to JP, and we can get those back over to you guys, because there is something here which I haven't had the opportunity to ask because we're out of time again. Final thing from me is our next webinar is on the 12th of December at 4 p.m. GMT or 11 o'clock, obviously, Eastern time in the US, which will be our last one of the year. And we have got a great one for you as well. And no pressure on the man himself to follow on from JP. But our final one for the year will be on the future of SEO. And it's with none other than Google's John Mueller. So get signing up now. We're going to push out the link on social and obviously on the blog, and probably in the follow-up to this, to give you the exact opportunity to sign up for that. But it's going to be a cracker to finish the year off, to wrap up all of the things that we have talked about over 2018, and think about the future and think about where we go in 2019. So without further ado, big thank you, JP Sherman. Again, I really appreciate the chat, and I look forward to seeing you soon in person. And my name is John Myers. That was the Deepcrawl webinar on how to use site search as a marketing multiplier. Thank you, everybody that joined us.
All right.